today we have Bruce Dixon. He's a former professional football player, a former corporate executive, a former award-winning social venture CEO, but he left it all behind to travel to the world researching, and he's in the process of writing a book. Let's have a conversation. So Bruce, what is it that would compel you to leave a thriving corporate career and then an award-winning social venture, and then launch into the unknown?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So thanks again, Dr. Rob, for having me today. So I don't think it's ever one thing, right? It's always an amalgam of things. So in my case, probably the easiest way and the best way to describe it would be, we create narratives for our lives, right? So our culture, our families, traditions, you start to develop a story, right? So my story was, hey, you know what? Do well in school, go to college, go to graduate school, excel and climb the corporate ladder, leave there, run a company, do good. And the narrative for me was, at the end of all this, I was going to find this great pot of gold and be really satisfied or something along those lines. But along the way, the story started to sort of unravel a little bit.
Okay.
Right? So you get to the point where it's like, I'm supposed to do all these things and I'm supposed to experience joy and fulfillment and almost ecstasy in many ways. And at some point, the story started to unfold a bit and you realize, wait a minute, I'm doing all these things. And in my case, I achieved all of these things. And then at the end of it, it's like, oh, so now what? So now what? So you have to make a decision. Right. Either you continue to do this or you decide to do something else. And in my case, sort of the pain of staying in the same scenario was greater than the thought of trying to do something else.
I see. Mm-hmm.
Right. So for me, it was almost like, to use an analogy of a plant. It was like I felt like I was planted in this certain pot, and the pot had just gotten too small. And if I'd stayed in that pot, it would really been uncomfortable for me, and it probably ended up, doing things in a deviant manner of some regard. And decided to sort of launch out to really see if I could better understand sort of how I could expand my perspectives, how I might look at things differently, and more than anything else, how could I sort of create a way that I can serve the world in a better way.
Okay. So now that you ventured out to start to do something, but first of all, tell me a little bit more about what you did. So you came to this conclusion that you wanted to do something different.
Yeah.
And so what happened? I mean,
right.
When you just
right. You know what happened?
You just got on a plane and just decided to go. I mean, decided to go and just got on a plane, or
yeah. So what happened was, again, you get to this point. You have a decision point. You're sort of at a crossword. Right. What are you going to do? Either I'm just going to continue to do this, or I'm going to do something else. And for me, again, that's why it's more than just one thing. So throughout the years, you read different books, you meet different people. I've met a number of people who traveled the world and read a lot of books, Emerson and a bunch of other people who sort of talked about this value of travel. And while I'd traveled prior, to this time, most of the travel had been, the 2-week, vacation from work, which for me, it was never really vacation, right? It was kind of a matter of, let me go someplace that had good internet connection so I could get on and work, right? So I'm on vacation because I slept until 10 and I did some work until 1 and then I did something until, went outside and, enjoyed sort of a tour or something for a few hours and then I'm back online to work again. So I didn't really consider that travel. So for me, I knew that travel, there was this richness of travel that I didn't understand. And I thought it would be a great way. It's the other thing, it's like, either do that or go a more traditional route from somebody in my position of getting a PhD or something along those lines. So for me, I thought, let's sort of launch out to see what this travel experience could really do.
You said something, you gave me a quote one time of somebody who said they traveled the world with their feet or something like that.
Yeah.
Could you tell me what you?
Yeah, I know what you're.
Okay, yeah.
Right, I know what you're making reference to.
Yeah.
But in essence, it was, if life is a book, and if you haven't traveled, you've only read the first page.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
So that was kind of the sentiment of the quote.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, it was something about, maybe I told you the quote, about something where somebody, the world was a book, and he did it with his feet through travel.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So now I want to move. I know we're kind of moving ahead here, but I wanted to, now that you decided to go travel the world and you're doing some research.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if the research came as a result of your travel, or did some things begin to be revealed to you through your travel that took you down this path of your research. So tell us a little bit more about this research. I think you tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think sort of the progression was okay. Progression for me was okay. I want to take this leap. Right, I want to sort of launch out. I want to travel. I want to explore. I want to expand the possibility of me doing more.
Okay.
Right, and serving more. It sounds nice and romantic, right? But what I did was I gave my company a year, and I said I'm going to take a year, and after a year I'm going to leave. So then I left, and you said, what did I do? Well, basically, through a lot of research, I found that there were organizations around the world who, in some cases, you pay a fee or not pay a fee, and they would align you with a school or a social organization. You can go and volunteer.
Okay.
So for me, it was like a sort of a bridge. So going from sort of running a company to sort of leaving and volunteering and helping people and sort of easing into this idea that I was going to travel and not sort of do the things that I'd done before. Sounds really romantic. Started in Spain, volunteering at a social group in Spain, doing some work there. But what started to really happen was you sort of leave the identity, or basically, in a really crude kind of way of saying, you're sort of killing the narrative that you created for yourself.
Okay.
Right? Pretty scary.
Right. Exactly.
Right? Because you're basically saying the narrative that you created for yourself, it's no longer valid for what you want to do. So for me, the first few months, 6-7 months of the travel were excruciating, because you're sort of letting go of a story.
Exactly.
Right? You're letting it go.
Right.
So this whole point of letting go of the story, and then you're sort of left into a state of almost like a childlike state or a beginner's mind, because you've just closed the book on the story. So now you're in a position of recreating the story, which is pretty amazing. It sounds romantic, but it's really pretty difficult, right, emotionally, because you're denying the story that you created for yourself.
Exactly.
Right.
Although that story contributed to where you are now.
Of course.
But now you're revising the narrative, or you're starting a new narrative.
Correct.
Right.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right. And so now as you started doing the travels and you started expanding your mind, so to speak. Just tell me a little bit about this research you're doing into the mind.
Yeah, so I was always fascinated.
And how the experiences helped you, the mind expansion.
Yeah.
Or is helping to shift your paradigm.
Yeah.
In terms of how in terms of and what you're learning about the power of the mind.
Yeah, I was always fascinated with human performance. Like I was always fascinated, why is it that some people seem to be able to overcome obstacles and grow and create large-scale businesses or campaigns or missions? Like, what is it about those people? 'Cause I fundamentally believe that we sort of are born sort of with the same hardware, right? So it's not like somebody's kind of born. I think genetically we might be predisposed to big picture thinking or more detail.
Right.
But the capacity to do things, I think, is infinite for everyone, right? So for me, I was always like, well, why is it that I'm here and I want to serve more? What would it take to get there? So human performance is always interesting to me.
I just want to say something. You said people have infinite capacity,
correct?
Right? But I think people have infinite capacity in different ways. So
I agree.
Your infinite capacity could be this way, and somebody else's could be another way. So
I agree.
Right.
Great. But I agree that the opportunity to do more.
Right.
Right. So I was always fascinated by it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been fascinated by and reading books on, everyone from Mandela to Steve Jobs to, Peter Diamandis and Warren Buffett. Right. You start to think like, what is it that takes people there?
Well, I just want to say something to that, because interestingly, it's what you feed your mind.
Of course.
So if you're feeding your mind Warren Buffett and Nelson Mandela and these people,
correct,
then you're going to have a different mindset than somebody who's feeding their mind that or other kinds of things.
Exactly.
Right. So
exactly. So for me, the trip and travel and all these other things again started with sort of the unraveling of the story.
Okay.
But now it's kind of like, how do you create the new story? And then it was sort of just feeling your way through it at some point. Right. Sort of, where do I go from here? And then I had, for the first time in many years, I had an opportunity to do something. Is that I had an opportunity to delve into a subject matter without the distraction of running a company.
Okay.
Right. So, to your point, I started reading things on mindset.
Okay.
And fortunately, these days we have something called the internet, where once you have an interest, you can take a deep dive and go down a rabbit hole
That never ends.
that never ends, right? So that's really what started to happen to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I started to think about, okay, what about mindset? What about human performance? And you just start, you pick up a book and they make reference to another person or some branch of research, and you just start following it, and you start following it, and you start following it. And for me, it was like, oh, wait a minute. And it led me to sort of interesting places, like neuroscience, right? And he's kind of thinking, okay, neuroscience, and you started to hear about the research that's been done over the last 20 years and understanding the brain and how the brain works. And that for me was a big deal. Undergrad, I studied biology, right? But not deeply studied neuroscience. I was interested in science. But all the research that's been done over the last 20 years in neuroscience is fascinating. And when you started to go down this rabbit hole and read more and study more, I was just like blown away by the fact that, hey, wait a minute. I never really thought about the brain in terms of what the brain's role is relative to how I perform. I always sort of thought of it as like an organ that just sort of went off and did its own thing. It's kind of like, this is who I am, and the brain is signaling me to do things. But you really start to appreciate, I'm feeding and influencing the brain, and the brain is basically a passive participant in that its basically job is to keep me safe.
Okay.
So if I tell them to do something, right? If I tell them like, these flowers here or something are in some way harmful for me, it's gonna signal to my body, get away from the flowers or do something along those lines. Right. So this idea.
Its basic instinct then is to protect you and keep you safe.
Yeah. And understanding that when you're in this state of fear,
right,
or your body's going to get out, fight, flee, etc. And then of course all the hormonal things that happen is in terms of cortisol flooding into your system and adrenaline and things along those lines. So I was just sort of fascinated and struck by the fact that, hey, wait a minute, our thoughts, right? We can influence or shape our brain, right, to do the things in the way that we'd like to do them. Versus, before it was kind of like, in a really primitive way, if something happened and I felt angry about something, you just think that's just the way it is. But then understanding when you're angry or you're in a real state of fear, perceived or real fear, right, then you're going to not be able to sort of perform in a way that you could in terms of higher level thinking. So that was one branch that really fascinated me. And the more I sort of spent time with it, and then it became sort of like I need to really start to think about it as a practice, and like how am I really, what am I feeding myself? I'll tell you just a funny side, right? So a funny side is like when you're traveling, like I was traveling, I started to put myself into positions of, well, wait a minute, these things scare me. Right. And then you start to ask yourself, at some point, it's like, is it a real fear or is it just a perceived fear? And then you start to understand there's a difference. And some things are just perceived, but your brain doesn't know the difference. Right. So starting to sort of confront those things and push yourself through some of those things sort of led me to some interesting ends. So that sort of led to one branch of the research.
Yeah, and so one of the things that, because this idea of when you live in a fear-based life, right? Or you are in the fear mode, or you're fearful, then all the blood kind of rushes to the parts of the body that's going to help you get to either freeze,
or flee,
or fight.
Right.
So then, if you're in that mode all the time, then that means that the blood is being rushed. They say the places it rushes to is to your legs.
Of course, because you can run or
run
or jump or kick.
So while the blood is rushing there, it's not going to other places in the body. So imagine living a long period of time, 5, 10 years, 20 years, where the blood is constantly being rushed to those parts of the body, which means the other parts of the body that needs it is being deprived.
Correct.
Right. So what effects is that going to have on you in the long term?
Yeah, it's interesting.
On your health.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I ran a company. So I ran a company for 10 years. And hindsight, 3 years after sort of making this decision to leave, I appreciate now, wow, I now understand some of the challenges I put my organization through because I was in this state of fear. I was approaching things from the perspective of, Oh, maybe you're not going to have enough here. What's going to happen if the regulation happens here? What happens if this is the case here, right? And obviously you should be concerned, right? This isn't a matter of Pollyanna saying, you know, hey, the sky is falling all the time, or there's nothing going on.
Right.
But to understand, I understand now that constantly I was in this state, right? Waking up in the morning at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, you know, in the morning, like, you know, I've got to get this done. If I don't get this done, you know, the world's going to collapse. And in reality, you realize now, 3 years later, well, it's not going to collapse.
Right.
Right. But you're in this state constantly. So your decision making, you know what I mean? Your decision making is based on this now.
Right.
Because I have to protect this. And now I see hindsight, the opportunity you have, right? So many people, whether it be philosophers, religious leaders, spiritual teachers, mystics, have always talked about the mind and what you think.
Right.
Right? You become what you think, right? And you hear it, you're like, yeah. But when you start to really understand, like, yeah, if I'm signaling to myself, right, that these things, like my life is going to end if I don't get this contract,
right,
or
exactly.
if this company fails, right? Because companies fails, right? You know, most
Right,
companies
fail,
fail, right?
right.
But if you're in this moment that,
knowing that's driving that because you're constantly worried about the company failing.
right?
Right.
Because then it becomes a social thing. Like, I'm afraid because if the company fails, not that I'm going to starve. In my case, it was a matter of like, what are people going to think of you?
Okay.
Right. That's why I'm saying
failed, right.
Right. Rational fear,
Right.
or real fear, or perceived
fear. Right.
But if you're afraid, I'm afraid, oh my gosh, you know, what is everybody going to think of me if this company fails?
But then the other thing, you have other worries like, what are these people going to, because when we had our company,
Yeah.
it's like, where are these people going to work? You know, you're worried about the people and what's going to happen to them.
Right. As if really you could really control all of those variables anyway.
Right, exactly.
Right. But I you know, the big picture piece here in terms of the research and some of the things that I'm doing, understanding now, is that it is possible for us to influence our brain, right, such that you can train it, just like you train your muscles, your biceps or your triceps, right, or you learn mathematics. You can practice, right, and train your brain to perform in a way that's really important.
Right.
Like, and you can get yourself to the point where you can, in my case, really be able to discern this is a real fear or it's a perceived. And if it's perceived, I know I have the ability to move myself past that and not allow my brain to signal to my body that this is fear and this is I have to fight or I have to flee.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that's been really important.
But then the other thing, because it makes you think too about, because many of us live in a culture where we do live fear-based.
Sure.
That's how we live.
Sure.
But where many people live where they really are in a situation where they you know, so they like you said, what do you call that?
Food insecurity.
Food insecurity, shelter insecurity, and all these things that make you just have fear-based living all the time.
Sure.
And so you can see why people begin to have real health issues because,
no doubt about it.
you know, and I can just say from my own personal experiences, you realize, like, how many times have you heard of people right after they retire?
Yeah.
They expire, right? Yeah. Well, what happened was the body was on adrenaline that whole entire time. And so it was an overdrive. And so when you stopped, because the body just did what it had to do to keep going.
Sure.
So then when you stopped, then it was like, whew, and then now you realize something stopped functioning because it was working. All the blood, working overtime to keep you safe and keep you going.
Right.
Then when you slowed down, it realized like, oh, I'm not even working. Something else is making me work. The organ just stopped. You know, even with the heart, people have a heart attack right after they or a stroke, and so it just shows that I think for me, it's the concern is how the thinking can affect the health.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, right? Because for me, so I leave the company, I start traveling, right? So, you know, I'm doing some volunteer work, but I'm not engaged to the degree that I was before, right? And then after a couple of volunteer opportunities, I was basically just traveling, right? And it's weird because it's almost in many ways you go through a detox. Right. Because my body,
it takes about 2 years.
Right. I was accustomed to the adrenaline. I was accustomed to being pumped up with cortisol, right, all day, right, for years. And then when you're not, it's weird, right? You feel like, wait a minute, something's wrong. Something's wrong with me.
Right.
So I need to go back and maybe I need to go back and jump back in to activate this because your body gets accustomed to it.
Right.
It's just like where's all the cortisol? Where's all the adrenaline? You know,
Right.
and for me, it's kind of like, Bruce, think about it, right? You're in a wonderful country, in some amazing place, doing exactly what you want to do.
Right. Right.
And then your body's freaked out because it's
Right.
kind of like something's wrong. It's not good that you're here on the beach having, coconut water and reading and exercising and eating healthy,
Right.
because your body is, well, where's all the cortisol?
Right.
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 So I think the work with neuroscience and the research that's going on in neuroscience now I think it's so important because you really start to appreciate the power of your thoughts and the power of the focused thoughts
Right.
and deliberate. You realize you can be deliberate about how you train your brain.
Okay.
Just like you trained everything else. It sounds like it's interesting, right? In many ways, we go to school and we study and we do things. We don't think of it as training our brain, right? We think it as acquiring knowledge and information and doing things along those lines. But it's easy to remember or to identify with, oh yeah, I wanted to become a bodybuilder or lift weights, so I go to the gym, and I know the first time I go to the gym, I can lift 5 pounds. But I do it over 2 or 3 years, I'm lifting weights and doing things I never thought I could do.
Right.
But never really thought about, I can actually train my brain to help me perform better, to help me perform in a less stress-filled way. Because when you're performing in a way that's almost like a flow state, when you're joyful, when you're happy, when you're not in fear,
Right.
the prefrontal
Frontal lobe,
cortex,
right. That's
right,
another thing that's
right, the
important to talk
prefrontal
about,
cortex,
right.
right, is activated, and in fact, people have shown, you can actually, you can change the structure of your prefrontal cortex.
Right.
And another thing about the research that's been done, 20 years ago, people thought, from a neuroscience perspective, that your brain was fixed. By the time you were 6, 8, 10, it was fixed,
Right.
and you couldn't move beyond it. Well, this is absolutely critical to understand.
Right. It
Is
expands.
they call it the brain plasticity, which means that you can change the shape of your brain until the day you die.
Wow. I don't think many of us know that.
Right? And understanding that it's not fixed, it's not
Right.
static, which means you can continue to grow and change and become another person in many ways your entire life.
Right, because your body's going to do what the brain tells it to do.
Correct.
Or the brain going to do. Did
Right.
I get that right? Right.
Yes.
So, and people don't realize how much control they have over their own bodies. Right.
Through their thoughts.
Through their thoughts.
Correct.
So, and this is what we're talking about now, how the power of your thoughts and how the thoughts can change your destiny. It can change, your life, your destiny,
Yes.
and everything. So
Everything.
it's very, very important.
And I think it's really important. And for me, it's, before this trip, I was very cavalier about what I thought about and what I talked about. Cavalier. Just
Right.
thinking who cares?
Right.
Who cares? I'm thinking about this in this way. I'm sitting, in my case, right? And this is not for anyone else to say or feel that they have to sort of adhere to, but in my case, it was like, one of my sisters, I would see one of my sisters, right, often, and she and I would see each other. We sort of had this running dialogue.
You mean a sister? You mean one of your
One of my sisters, my sister Regina.
Oh, okay.
So
Gotcha.
right, so she and I would get together, and we were together. It was kind of funny because everybody sort of expected us to crack on each other.
Right.
So we'd get together, and I'd be like, "Oh, look at your hair now. Who did this, that, and the other?" And then she'd say, "Well, who did this, that, and the other to you?" And it's kind of like this running dialogue, or even with some of the boys, right? We kind of had this thing, but I never thought about.
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
If
You spend your time laughing about something that in many ways it's influencing you and influencing them, right? And so I've learned, and again, a part of the research in the book that I'm researching for is basically a few concepts. Like number one, that whether it be religious or again mystics, right, or even Newton's third law of motion. Whatever you put out, is coming back to you. So this is, again, physics
It's
spiritual.
It's a universal law.
But if that law is true, and I believe that it is, right? Think about the power of that relative to, we might think of it, and I was sort of in a more naive, immature state. I always thought of it as something physical, right? If I punch somebody, then they're gonna hit me back. right? Or basically, if I stole something, maybe it's going to somehow. But when you really start to think about it, your thoughts are the same.
Oh yeah.
So whatever thoughts you put out, and thoughts you put out, or words you put out, right, are coming back. The intent of the word.
Right. Okay.
Right? The intent. So that's true, right? That's a really important thing relative to our thoughts, right? Our beliefs,
right,
and ultimately our actions. Right? Our actions are a byproduct of our beliefs, right? So that was one of the really big ones. And the other one was kind of getting a fear-based, abundance. And thinking about abundance, right? Because if you walk around thinking every day, I don't have. Well,
that's what you're telling the universe.
And you're telling your body, your brain, and everything about you is saying, okay, we don't have enough, so I got to fight and survive, and I got to fight and struggle, and right. And for me, I started to appreciate abundance in a different way. Before, I used to always think of abundance as, again, external.
I just want to say this though, because I don't think we realize, if you think about it, I don't think we realize how much what we think it helps us create our reality.
It does create.
So if I think I don't have,
then
you're not going to have.
Correct.
If I think I have, because now we're dealing with the law of attraction.
Yes.
Right. Too. So So if you think I have, you think I can do this, then you're going to do it.
Yes.
Right. And like you said when we spoke before, what you have vision. If you have the visual of it, and you have the vision of it.
Sure.
You have to see it, imagine it, and then you can bring it to you. But going back to the whole the idea of the mind creating your reality.
Yeah.
Your mind, what you think, really creates reality. What was the name of the book that I gave you from Ivan?
As a Man Thinketh.
As a Man Thinketh.
Yeah.
I mean, it's about an 80.
Lesson.
That's about 60-page book, but it's one of the most profound readings that I've done.
Sure.
In terms of how the mind shapes your reality. Everything that you do and everything that happens in your life that he talks about in the book is a result of what you thought. It's of your thoughts.
Right. Everything's created twice.
Okay.
First in your mind, and then it's physical.
Then it's physical. Exactly.
It's created twice.
Right.
Right. So, to your point, it's always created twice.
So a lot of people think my life is this because, and we understand it's a lot of things.
It's not as linear, as clean.
Right,
exactly.
But a lot of the way your life turns out
has
influenced by how you think.
No doubt.
Right. So.
No doubt about it. Everybody, it's been said by people throughout the ages.
In fact,
right.
I meant to say one of the primary principles of ancient wisdom and thought.
Yeah.
I think they talk about 7, but one of them we'll come back and I'm going to talk about that again. But they talk about the first principle, the first universal principle and law is that it's all mind.
It's all mind.
It's all mind. And they even talk about how we're just a creation of God's mind.
Yes.
And so.
It's all mind.
It's all mind.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating to me. And it's also really empowering.
Right. When you understand that. I want to go back to just quickly when you were talking about our mind expanding. I remember I had a friend, and we, I've debated him and went back and forth with him on it. He was a lot older than I was back then.
Yeah.
And he talked about how your mind expands, and I'm like, that's ridiculous. He was like, no, your mind physically expands. He got really.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I actually felt it myself. Like I had a moment, and I remember my father telling me when I was a child, he was saying every 7 years, you change.
Yeah.
And so then I started doing research, and the research can kind of confirm that.
Yeah.
And so we talk about the life cycle and all the different phases you go through in the life cycle.
Sure.
But it wasn't until I actually felt a physical phenomena of my mind feeling like it expanded that I realized that is real. So when you said that the mind, what did you call it, plasticity? What did you call that?
Neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity, that the mind actually restructures and can reshape. And I also want to say a little about the prefrontal lobe. They call it the spiritual brain. And so you're saying that people in a constant survival mode, then you can't have that higher level of thinking. It's hard to activate the prefrontal lobe when all the other 3 brains, I think you talk about the 3 brains, I think it was, the mammalian brain, the reptilian brain, which we call the animal brain, the mammalian brain, and then the intellectual brain, of what, I'm probably screwing those up, but in any event. And so many of us don't even activate the prefrontal lobe to do the maximum things that it can do. And so you want to get away from the fear-based thinking so that you can activate the higher brain,
Sure.
or the higher thinking brain, or the spiritual brain,
Sure.
so that you can
Yeah.
get the best out of this thing that we call
Well,
life.
well, yeah, it's funny you say that, because it's like one of the things that sort of struck me one day is kind of walking around. It's like when you have all this capacity to use your mind, right?
Yeah.
To use the mind and to think about it. When I had, I had some what I would call, childlike thoughts, and that of jealousy. Like, I'm jealous because of what someone else did, and I'm thinking about, well, why did that happen? And I'm thinking of that brain, of all the things that I could use this wonderful imagination in our brains and thoughts for.
Right.
Why would I dwell on something that's so juvenile?
Right.
And I could think about how do you produce things in a way that serves every human being on the planet?
Right.
Right. Why not? If I had that capacity, why would I spend my time, focusing on that person doesn't like the way I look?
Right.
Right.
Right, exactly. And to that also, how people get stuck.
Sure.
So something happened to you, because as you go through life, you're going to get battle scars.
Sure. Sure.
And you're going to, people are going to hurt your feelings. Things are just going to happen. But what happens for many of us is that we get stuck on those thought patterns, and those thought patterns become repeated, and we just keep living that out and thinking the same. She hurt me, she said this, she did that,
Well,
he did that.
that's your brain is shaped. Now
Right.
it's like it created this, it's like muscles. Now you've
Right.
created the muscle that says this is getting stronger and stronger and stronger, right?
Right. So then you go through life guarded.
Yeah.
You block, okay? You block all the good things that can come to you because your thought patterns are now, oh, he's after me, or she's going to do this to me, or she's, or they're trying to take advantage of me, or they're taking me for granted,
Right.
and all those things, the
Yeah.
fear-based stuff, and so
Right.
it just makes it very, very challenging to live a healthy, productive life.
And to maximize the potential that we all have.
Exactly. Right. Alrighty. Do you have anything else you would like to share, or?
Dr. I really appreciate you having me on the show today. And I guess, I often think about if I were to leave anything to anybody, someone asked me if you could share anything with anybody, one thing that would I share with people, it really would be this notion that whatever we put out, it comes back. And you can decide to do whatever you'd like to put out. And another analogy that's funny along those lines was, I sort of read something one day, and it was talking about this whole notion that our thoughts create. And they were saying that understanding this concept is really important, because it's almost like if you planted mango seeds, yes, and then you went to harvest, and you pulled a mango off of a tree, and you were pissed off that it wasn't an apple, right? Because you're like, oh man, I wanted apples. But you planted mango seeds.
Right.
Right? So your thoughts and your beliefs planted whatever they planted.
I like that. I like that. Give me something that's more in terms of what we do. It's like, so you would plant some negative thought, all right, or but you expect something else. Give me.
If I for me, an example is if I
like
walk around in a state of hate.
Right.
If I hate people. And then I experience life, and there's a hate, or there's some derivation of it or manifestation of it, and I'm thinking, I can't understand why that happens.
Right.
I'm planting it.
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
Right? So for me, these are the things that if I could leave anybody, it's you get back what you put out. And not just physical, but your thoughts.
Right. Right. And I just want to add to that, because I don't think we really get to and that's one of the universal principles.
Sure.
That's just a law. People don't understand how real serious this thing with the law. It's a law.
Correct.
That what you put out will eventually it's nothing.
Words,
you can't even get around
the intent of your words.
Right. Intent of how you even
thoughts.
think.
Yes.
Is going to bring what you think back to you. So
yes.
anyway.
So thank you very much, Dr. Ra.
Okay.